Unless you've been living under a rock, you've heard that New York's next mayor could be a Muslim communist. It sounds crazy to most Americans, but JD Vance explained what propelled Zohran Mamdani to beat Andrew Cuomo in the Democrat primary. Watch.
Last week, as has become sort of the main political story over the last couple of weeks, a 33-year-old communist running an insurgent campaign beat a multi-million-dollar establishment machine politician in the New York Democratic mayoral primary. Now, I don't want to harp too much on a municipal election, but there were two interesting threads that I think came out of Mamdani's victory that I think are worth us understanding because they're reflective of where the broader American left is at this moment in time. The first is that it drives home just how much the voters in each of the respective parties have changed. If President Trump's victory in 2024 was rooted in a broad, working, and middle-class coalition, Mamdani's coalition is almost the inverse of that. If you look at his electoral performance, precinct by precinct, what you see is a left that is completely left behind the broad middle of the United States of America. This is a guy who won high-income and college-educated New Yorkers, and especially both young, highly educated New Yorkers, but he was weakest among black voters and weakest among those without a college degree. That's an interesting coalition. Maybe it works in the New York Democratic primary. I don't think it works particularly well in the United States at large. He did particularly well in the Bangladeshi areas of New York, but he did particularly poorly with non-Bangladeshi Asian immigrants, particularly Chinese Americans. And if you look at the precincts where he did the best, it was in New York's gentrifying neighborhoods, places like Ridgewood and Bushwick, places I haven't heard anything about, but I read about in a paper. His victory was the product of a lot of young people who live reasonably comfortable lives, but see that their elite degrees aren't really delivering what they expected. And so their own prospects with all the college debt may not in fact be greater than those of their parents. And I say that not to criticize them, because I think that we should care about all the people in our country, particularly those downwardly mobile, college-educated people who feel like the American dream is not quite all it's cracked up to be. But we have to be honest about where his coalition is. It is not the downtrodden. It is not poor Americans. It is not about dispossession. It's about elite disaffection and elite anger. The party of highly educated but downwardly mobile elites, they comprise a highly energetic activist base, but it's important because it's not just the elites, the college-educated New Yorkers. That base was supplemented by carefully selected ethnic blocs carved out of the electorate using identity politics as the knife. And that, by the way, I think explains Mamdani's bizarre appeals to foreign politics intended to signal to one particular group of New Yorkers or another. Let us ask ourselves, why is a mayoral candidate in our nation's biggest city whining about banning Bibi Netanyahu, a country whose population is about the same size as that of New York, and threatening to arrest a foreign leader if he tries to come to New York City? Why is a New York mayoral candidate attacking Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, as a war criminal? Why is he talking about globalizing the intifada? In fact, what the hell does that even mean in Manhattan? But what might seem like a contradiction makes a little bit of sense if you peel back the onion. Consider a movement that rails against the billionaire class, despite the fact that the billionaire class remains firmly in the quarter of the modern left. A movement that idolizes foreign religions, even as it rejects the teachings of those faiths. It rails, this new modern left, against white people, even as many of its funders and its grassroots activists are privileged whites themselves. Now, I may not speak for many of you, but I was once comforted by these contradictions within the modern left. How could privileged whites march around with a straight face decrying white privilege? How could progressives pretend to love conservative Muslims despite those Muslims' views on gender and sexuality. But the answer is obvious if you think about it, and it's a very, very dangerous and very sad answer. The radicals of the far left, they don't need a unifying ideology of what they're for because they know very well what they're against. What unites Islamists, gender studies majors, socially liberal white urbanites, and big pharma lobbyists, it isn't the ideas of Thomas Jefferson or even of Karl Marx. It's hatred. They hate the people in this room. They hate the President of the United States. And most of all, they hate the people who voted for that President of the United States in the last election in November.
So, Bedford, let's go out to you for this one because the Democrat analysis is what we love from you, especially. So, what do you make of Vance's assessment of this left-wing coalition that we're seeing right now?
You know, it was so spot on that I broke embargo and sent it to a friend who's dealing with this with his parents right now. Now, his parents, don't worry, we didn't publish it. I said, holy smokes, this nailed it. Because he couldn't get to the bottom of it. You know, he's one of his father's mother and father were in Auschwitz. His mother survived, his father did not. He got out, his grandparents, excuse me. They fled to South Africa, had a family there. But because of his family's history, he's very guarded all the time against anti-Semitism and despotism and other dangers that can turn what seemed like a civilized society very uncivilized very quickly. And because of that, he really hates Donald Trump. Like he's gone a little crazy about it. And this person is a very well-educated, very successful, wealthy doctor, former ranking federal official in the health services. So this is someone who really knows their stuff and is a kind and like gentle person. But in politics, he gets really crazy. And his wife is a very well-educated person who leads foundations. She's retired now, but also completely filled with this sort of loathing. And at the same time, despite being so afraid, seeing fascists behind every shadow and Nazis around every corner, as New Yorkers, they're totally fine with this mayoral candidate. And you got to wonder, their son could not figure this out. What is driving this? Don't you see globalize, the intifada is something which I know we're going to talk about later, but that's something that's very serious. But what unites them is that mutual hatred. And, you know, my wife got asked on one of the Sunday shows, what do you make of this? Why won't he walk this back? The political dangers in New York, why isn't this something that he'll say, hey, you know what, I got ahead of my skis or something? And her answer was correct. It's because he believes it. You have to eventually start to understand that folks who say things believe it. And if the ideas that he is bringing to this country and talking about in this mayoral race sound foreign, then to my point in the A block, it's because they are. They're not the kind of ideas that we've had a lot of corrupt politicians in New York. We've had a lot of immigrants. It's a city filled with immigrants. You could probably walk 25 blocks and hear more languages than that in Manhattan or Queens or Brooklyn, and it's a cool place to visit. But this is a whole departure from what we've seen before with this great American city, and it's a serious threat. And I think the vice president's analysis of what's uniting this disparate coalition is not just defense of the victims and defense of the powerless. And some of the things that have traditionally united the global and the American left, which is seeing society as oppressors and oppressed as opposed to civilization and barbarism. A lot of what drives and unites them, if anything unites them much anymore, is mutual loathing. You know, I can kind of understand that. That's how libertarians and fiscal conservatives, et cetera, and hawks and social cons all ended up having to share a car for 30 years in the American conservative movement. There's mutual hatred of communism. Sometimes those groups didn't get along, and that eventually came to a head over the last 10 years or so. But this is a coalition that's not even largely driven by values. The working class values, the green values have gone by the wayside. I mean, look at Obama, President Biden's and the Treasury Secretary, the Transportation Secretary's response to a town in Ohio being nuked essentially by a train disaster or chemical. This is something that is perfectly in the Democrats' wheelhouse. You've got safety regulations, you've got environmental degradation, you've got regulation of rails and corporations that's put a ton of money into American politics. Trains may not be at their heyday, but boy, do they pay for a lot of politicians, and they have a lot of sway because they have a lot of economic interests in states. And yet they couldn't even bring themselves to look at it. Why? It's because it was a Trump voting red town. It was something that they just didn't like, and they didn't see the positives of what American liberalism had once previously stood for, or the venom you're seeing coming out of that pediatrician, a literal children's doctor in Houston, Texas, earlier today, posting on Facebook about how these children who were washed away from a girls' Christian summer camp, from all ethnicities, by the way, deserved it because the way their parents voted and blessed their heart, or from an appointee in the Houston government who runs a nonprofit farmers market or something, coming out and saying these people are awful, they deserve it, they're segregationists, all this insanity. That is hate. That is pure hate.
All right, I'm going to turn to our editor-in-chief now and ask him to ignore the fact that you didn't abide by the embargo. We're going to pretend that didn't happen, Bedford. But I want to ask you, MP, are conservatives actually going through and underestimating Mamdani in just everything that's going on right now in New York City?
No, it's a great question. I mean, my personal side here is wrong, right? Because I feel as if, in my heart, I want to believe this is ridiculous. This guy's not a serious person. I mean, I know he's a human being, but he's not a serious political figure. I can't bear to listen to this stuff. It's a mishmash of, millennial soup of bad ideas. It sounds terrible to me. It's hard for me to take it seriously. But, at this event is not only the vice president, I think Charlie Kirk also, without speaking out of school, gave some public remarks about the danger here, because he does represent where a lot of these people are. So beyond the hatred that unites them all, that Chris is pointing out, that the vice president hammered home, this, pastiche of ideas that are contradictory, that all flow together, that comes naturally to a lot of people in his class. These are wealthier people. A lot of them are white. They have all these, strange progressive ideas that are in this mishmash together, and they eat this stuff up. So there are a lot of people like him, and if he becomes the guy, the argument at this event was, you're going to have a bunch of copycats throughout the country where you're going to get a lot of lefties who are just going to eat this stuff up, and you're going to get a lot of candidates like this guy. So as much as I want to say this is silly, this is out of control, America is moving in the other direction, I think we really have to take it seriously.
Well, it's America's birthday over the weekend when this was all going on. We are going to get to JD Vance's, some of his most fiery comments after this.